Russia just lost something they believed was untouchable. Deep inside occupied Ukrainian territory, hidden away from satellite eyes and buried behind layers of classified clearance, Russia's most elite drone force had built something they thought was permanent, something they spent years constructing, something they poured billions of rubles and their best military minds into, and on a single night, in a matter of minutes, Ukraine burned it all to the ground. We're talking about Rubicon, Russia's crown jewel of unmanned warfare, the unit that was personally changing the entire course of this war for Russia, the unit that Putin had invested so heavily in that losing it wasn't even supposed to be a possibility. Ukraine didn't just destroy a building, Ukraine destroyed a capability, and that changes everything, not just in Donetsk, not just in Ukraine, but for the entire trajectory of modern drone warfare. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. The Rubicon strike is only the beginning of what Ukraine pulled off this week, because at the same time as Rubicon was going up in flames, Ukraine was also paralyzing Russia's entire military aviation repair system. Two aircraft plants hundreds of kilometers inside Russia struck in consecutive days. Russia's Air Force, already in a state of quiet collapse, has just been hit harder than at any point in this war. Stay with us because by the time you understand the full picture of what Ukraine just did in the span of 72 hours, you'll understand why military analysts are calling this a turning point. This is Signal Drop, and we're giving you the full picture. Let's start with Rubicon, because if you haven't heard of this unit, you need to understand exactly what it was before you can understand exactly what Ukraine just destroyed. For most of this war, Russia's drone program was a mess. It was fragmented. It was disorganized. Individual drone operators were scattered across different units with different equipment, different training, and no centralized command. Ukraine in the early years actually outpaced Russia in drone coordination. Russia had the numbers, but Ukraine had the structure. Then Rubicon changed that. Rubicon was built with a singular mission: to professionalize, centralize, and weaponize Russia's entire unmanned systems force. This wasn't a small field unit. According to reporting by Euromaidan Press, Rubicon had grown to approximately 5,000 personnel, making it one of the largest dedicated drone forces on any battlefield in the world. It had its own training pipelines. It developed its own technology. It had its own classified facilities hidden from Ukrainian intelligence, or so Russia believed. The Kyiv Independent described Rubicon in December using three words that say everything you need to know: deadly, elite, and scaling. And that word scaling is the one that was keeping Ukrainian commanders up at night. Because between February and November of 2025, Rubicon went from conducting 513 drone strikes per month against Ukrainian targets to over 2,246 per month. That is a more than four-fold increase in less than a year. Rubicon wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. Every month it got larger. Every month its strikes got more sophisticated. Every month the damage it inflicted on Ukraine got worse. And the targets Rubicon chose weren't random. This unit specialized in something that struck at the core of Ukraine's own military advantage. Rubicon's operators were specifically trained to hunt down Ukraine's drone pilots, to find them, to kill them, to systematically dismantle the very capability that Ukraine had built its defensive strategy around. Rubicon didn't just launch drones at positions on a map, it conducted counter-drone warfare. That's what made it irreplaceable. And that's why when Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, the SSO, announced on March 18th what they had done, the military world sat up and paid attention. So how did Ukraine find a classified facility that Russia had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide? This is where the story gets genuinely remarkable, because the answer involves Ukrainian intelligence operating at a level that Russia never anticipated, and it involves something else entirely. People inside occupied Donetsk who were watching, reporting, and feeding information to Kyiv while living under Russian occupation. Euromaidan Press confirmed that Ukraine's strike on Rubicon was aided by members of an underground anti-Putin resistance movement operating inside occupied Donetsk. These are civilians and former residents living under occupation, risking their lives to pass intelligence back to Ukrainian forces. Russia has spent years claiming that the people of Donetsk welcomed their occupation. The existence of an active underground resistance working to destroy Russian military facilities tells a very different story. And the result of that intelligence, Ukraine found the base. Ukraine found the control element of the unit, and Ukraine came prepared not for a single strike, but for a sustained methodical demolition. Here's what the SSO released publicly, and I want you to listen closely to this language because it is deliberate and specific. In Donetsk, long-range SSO drones hit the base of the classified Russian Center of Unmanned Technologies, Rubicon, and the control element of this unit. Also, the coordination center of the enemy's unmanned systems units was hit in the occupied city. Read that again. The base, the control element, and the coordination center. Three separate components of Rubicon's command infrastructure all hit in a single operation. This wasn't a lucky strike. This was a targeted decapitation of an entire military capability, and Ukraine didn't just make the announcement, they proved it. The SSO released video evidence alongside their statement. The footage, roughly a minute long, shows drone after drone hitting the Rubicon facility. It opens with the black and white thermal perspective of a Ukrainian drone zeroing in on its target. The first drone hits, then a second drone takes over, approaching the now burning compound. And then that second drone doesn't just circle the wreckage, it goes back in. It strikes the same building again. Multiple drones, multiple passes, multiple buildings within the compound. Each strike shows another structure catching fire. By the time the footage ends, what had been Russia's elite drone command center in Donetsk is a series of burning ruins. Ukraine didn't just hit Rubicon, Ukraine erased it. If you are finding this analysis valuable, this is the moment to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Signal Drop exists to give you the full picture on stories like this one. Not the headline, the depth behind it. We'll be right back. Now, let's talk about what this actually means strategically. The first consequence is immediate and obvious. Rubicon is gone. Its control element is destroyed. Its coordination infrastructure is in ashes. Until Russia rebuilds, which will take months, and which Ukraine's intelligence services will almost certainly be watching for in order to strike again, Rubicon cannot conduct the kind of coordinated drone operations that had been devastating Ukraine's forces. The unit that was doubling its strike rate every few months has for now gone silent. But the second consequence is the one that matters more in the long run, and it has to do with a gap in Ukraine's military capabilities that has existed for the entire war and that Ukraine has now closed. Here's the problem Ukraine was facing. Their FPV drones, the small, fast, first-person view drones that have become the signature weapon of this conflict, are devastating in the right conditions. But they have a fundamental limitation: range. FPV drones work across the front lines and in Ukraine's kill zones. They do not have the range to operate in the Russian rear inside occupied territory. So all of those high-value Russian assets that moved themselves 30, 40, 50 kilometers back from the front, for most of this war, they were safe. Ukraine's long-range drones solved the deep strike problem, but in the opposite direction. Using them to hit occupied Ukrainian territory meant pulling them away from the deeper campaign inside Russia. So Ukraine had a gap, a dead zone roughly 30 to 100 kilometers behind the front lines, where Russia could position its most valuable assets with relative impunity. Former U.S. Army Green Beret Brian Perkins described this exact problem to the Center for European Policy Analysis in January, and this is a quote that should be required reading for anyone following this war. He said, "Most of what matters now sits in the 30 to 100 kilometer range. Russia pushes expendable infantry forward while holding its most valuable systems deep and protected by electronic warfare. Ukraine does not have scalable systems that can reliably strike there. The strike on Rubicon proves that Ukraine has now solved it." The weapon Ukraine used is what analysts are calling the middle strike drone, a new category of drone capable of reaching targets between 30 and 100 kilometers from the front. It is the missing piece that Ukraine has spent the better part of a year quietly developing. The numbers bear this out. On March 19th, the Kyiv Post published an analysis of Ukraine's drone campaign in 2026. In the first half of March alone, Ukraine conducted 40 major attacks against targets in the mid and long range, covering distances between 50 and 250 kilometers. For context, Ukraine's previous record for strikes in this range was 57 attacks in December 2025. 40 attacks in 2 weeks puts Ukraine on track for 80 major strikes by the end of March. That would be more than a 50% increase over the previous record in a single month. But it's not just the number of attacks, it's the size of the swarms. In late 2025, the average drone swarm Ukraine was sending into occupied territory contained between 50 and 70 drones. In the 6 weeks leading up to March 18th, that average had risen to between 100 and 200 drones. The swarms have roughly tripled in size. What this tells us is not just that Ukraine built a new type of drone. It tells us that Ukraine built the industrial capacity to produce those drones at scale, in large enough quantities to deploy them in consistent, sustained operations. The Rubicon strike wasn't a one-time special operation. It was a demonstration of a new capability that Ukraine can now deploy repeatedly across occupied territory against any target that Russian forces believed was beyond Ukraine's reach. Russia just woke up to a world where nowhere behind the front lines is safe. Before we move on to what Ukraine hit next, there is one more element of the Rubicon story that deserves its own spotlight, because Rubicon wasn't just being destroyed from the outside, it was quietly falling apart from within. On February 16th, United 24 Media reported something that in a better resourced media environment would have been front-page news. One of Rubicon's elite drone operators had defected. Not deserted. Defected. He crossed over to Ukraine, contacted Ukrainian forces through a program called I Want to Live, and handed himself over. His name, as reported, is Myoslav Simonov. Before the war, he was a real estate professional from Novochakhtinsk. He had nothing to do with drones, nothing to do with the military, and nothing to do with Putin's war in Ukraine. He was detained by Russian police during a trip to Moscow for failing to comply with a compulsory service order. He was given what amounted to a choice with no good options. Go to the front via formal conscription, or sign up for a logistics unit that would at least keep him near his father. He chose the logistics unit. Over time, he found himself working for Rubicon. He tried to escape once before. He was caught, and as punishment, he was sent to the front lines as an assault soldier. Rather than participate in what he called Putin's suicidal meat assaults, he made contact with Ukraine's I Want to Live program. And then he did something that required extraordinary courage. He walked 10 kilometers through a combat zone to surrender. What happened next is the part of this story that defines the entire moral dimension of this conflict. As Simonov was being processed by Ukrainian forces, he watched as another Russian soldier was captured alongside him. That soldier was injured, and the Ukrainian fighter who found them didn't leave the injured soldier behind. He carried him. Simonov said in an interview, and I want to read this carefully, because these are the words of a man who spent time inside Russia's most elite military unit, and then made a choice. He said, "That's when I understood the difference between Russia and Ukraine." He was asked about his plans going forward. His answer? To fight. To kill. I have very serious grievances against my state. They broke not only my life, but the lives of many guys. That is what is happening inside Rubicon. That is the human reality behind the military statistics. Russia's most elite drone unit, the one with 5,000 personnel and a four-fold increase in monthly strike rates, is also a unit where soldiers are detained at police checkpoints, given false choices, and forced to fight in a war they never wanted. Where the best of Russia's drone operators decide that Ukraine is worth fighting for. Putin has burned both the base and the belief. We are halfway through the full picture, and the next part is where this story shifts from remarkable to genuinely historic. If you are watching on YouTube, hit subscribe right now. Signal Drop covers exactly this kind of depth every week. Don't miss what's coming next. But we told you at the beginning that Rubicon was only part of the story, because while all of this was happening, Ukraine was conducting a separate campaign that attacked something even more fundamental to Russia's ability to wage this war. Let's go back to March 16th. 2 days before the Rubicon strike, Ukraine's drones were already in the air, heading not toward occupied Donetsk, but toward the Russian interior. The destination was the Ulyanovsk region, located to the east of Moscow, approximately 800 kilometers from the Russian-Ukrainian border. That distance matters. It means these drones traveled deep into Russian territory, evaded Russian air defenses across hundreds of kilometers, and arrived at a target that Russia almost certainly considered beyond reach. That target was the Aviastar aircraft manufacturing plant. Aviastar is owned by United Aircraft Corporation, a subsidiary of Rostec, Russia's state military-industrial conglomerate. And Aviastar doesn't make consumer goods. It produces the AN-124 heavy cargo aircraft, one of the largest transport planes in the world. It produces the IL-78 aerial refueling tanker. And it produces the IL-76 MD-90A, Russia's primary military transport aircraft, the workhorse of Russian logistical air operations. Ukraine's drones hit the parking areas and the aircraft shelters at Aviastar on March 16th. In a single strike, Ukraine put a major dent in Russia's ability to produce the aircraft that move troops, move equipment, and keep Russian forces in the field. And then, the very next day, March 17th, Ukraine struck again. This time, the target was the 123rd Aircraft Repair Plant in Staroye Savino, in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region. The General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces released a statement explaining their targeting logic with precision. The plant, they said, specializes in the full cycle of repair and modernization of military transport aircraft and their components. It has its own runway, allowing it to receive heavy aircraft directly on the premises. Ukraine hit the hangar servicing multiple types of Russian military aircraft, including the IL-76 MD-90A and the L-410 light transport aircraft used extensively in Russian logistics. Let's pause on that for a moment. In 48 hours, Ukraine struck the plant that builds Russia's military transport aircraft and the plant that repairs them. Production and maintenance hit in consecutive days. Aircraft that need repair can't get repaired. The plant they would normally go to is now damaged. They sit on runways and in hangars, grounded, consuming resources, doing nothing. Meanwhile, Aviastar can't replace them. Russia's military aviation logistics have not been paralyzed by one strike. They've been attacked at both ends simultaneously. Here's the layer of context that most coverage of these strikes is missing. Russia's military aviation was already in serious trouble before Ukraine hit these facilities. A December 2025 report from the New Voice of Ukraine documented 2 incidents that illustrate the scale of this problem. An AN-22 aircraft crashed over Russia's Ivanovo Oblast, and around the same time, 2 Russian pilots died after an ejector seat malfunction, not in combat, not under fire, inside a hangar. Their aircraft was safely on the ground when the ejector seats activated and killed them. These are not isolated incidents, they are symptoms, and the root cause, according to aviation expert Pavlo Narozhny, who founded the nonprofit Reactive Mail, is sanctions. Russia has lost access to the Western components it needs to maintain its aircraft. Spare parts are running out, and when spare parts run out, military forces do something that is both logical and catastrophic. They cannibalize. They strip functioning aircraft for parts to keep other aircraft running. Narozhny described a moment that is almost absurd in its honesty. A Russian propagandist commenting on a Ukrainian strike that destroyed a Russian aircraft actually said, "It wasn't an important plane anyway. We were going to scrap it for parts." That is not the language of a functioning military. That is the language of a military in quiet collapse. And into this environment, into a Russian Air Force that is already cannibalizing its own planes, already struggling with maintenance, already losing pilots to equipment failures in hangars, Ukraine just destroyed both a production facility and a repair facility in the same week. The aircraft components that were inside those plants when Ukraine's drones hit, they're gone. In a Russia where those components are already scarce, where aircraft are being stripped for parts, where maintaining an airworthy fleet has become a daily struggle, losing those components is not just a setback, it may be irreplaceable. So let's put the full picture together. In 72 hours, from March 16th to March 18th, here is what Ukraine accomplished. On March 16th, Ukraine struck the Aviastar plant in Ulyanovsk, damaging production of Russia's military transport, cargo, and refueling aircraft. On March 17th, Ukraine struck the 123rd Aircraft Repair Plant, grounding aircraft waiting for maintenance with nowhere to send them. And on March 18th, Ukraine destroyed the classified command center, control element, and coordination hub of Rubicon using a new category of middle strike drone that Russia had believed couldn't reach it. The first two strikes degrade Russian logistics, their ability to move troops, equipment, and cargo across their own territory to the front. The third strike degrades Russian offensive drone capability directly on the battlefield, and they were all carried out within a single 72-hour window. This is not a series of coincidences. This is a coordinated campaign. And the results are already visible in the numbers. Ukraine's drone strike rate has practically doubled. The swarms are larger than at any point in the war. Ukraine has hit mid- and long-range targets at a pace that represents more than a 50% increase over its previous monthly record. Russia is not just losing ground on the front. Russia is losing the infrastructure, the equipment, and the specialized human expertise that allows it to fight the war at all. According to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance, Russia has now lost 435 aircraft and 349 helicopters since the start of the invasion. That amounts to approximately $8.5 billion in aerial equipment destroyed in less than 4.5 years. Russia has been forced to pull its aircraft far back from the front, using them to launch missiles and glide bombs from distances that keep them out of range of Ukrainian air defenses. They haven't been engaging in air superiority operations over the battlefield. They've been hiding, and now the plants that build their aircraft and the facilities that repair them are burning. Russia's total military casualty count has now reached 1.29 million people dead, injured, and captured over 4 years of fighting. Putin will send more. He always sends more. But every experienced drone operator who is killed, captured, or like Simonov chooses to defect is replaced by someone who is barely trained, barely motivated, and nowhere near ready for what they're about to face. Elite units are elite because of the people in them. You can rebuild a building. You can replace a drone. You cannot easily replace a skilled operator with years of training and operational experience. And Russia just lost the command structure of a unit filled with exactly those people. Let's close with the big picture, because what Ukraine demonstrated this week is something that military analysts will be studying for decades. This is what total spectrum drone warfare looks like. Ukraine is now running 3 parallel drone campaigns simultaneously. The FPV drones are operating across the front lines, creating a nightmare for Russian infantry. The middle strike drones are reaching into the near rear in occupied territory, taking out the high-value assets that Russia moved back specifically to protect them. And the long-range drones are reaching 800 kilometers into Russian territory, hitting factories, repair plants, and the industrial base that supports everything else. These aren't separate operations. They reinforce each other. Every long-range strike on a production facility means fewer replacement drones for Rubicon. Every Rubicon strike means less counter-drone capability, threatening Ukraine's FPV pilots. Every FPV strike on the front creates pressure that forces Russia to divert resources away from rebuilding the assets Ukraine just hit in the rear. Russia is being squeezed from every direction simultaneously. 3 months ago, Russia's most valuable assets were safe if they were a few dozen kilometers behind the front. Today, they are not. 3 months ago, Ukraine had no answer to Rubicon's relentless counter-drone campaign. Today, Rubicon's command center is ashes. 3 months ago, Russia's aircraft production and repair infrastructure, while struggling, was largely intact. Today, 2 of its most important facilities have been struck in the same week. The war in Ukraine is not over. Russia will rebuild. Russia will adapt. Putin will not acknowledge any of this publicly. He never does. But the losses are happening, the capabilities are degrading, and Ukraine, which has spent 4 years being told it can't win, is building weapons and executing strategies that are rewriting what victory looks like. Rubicon was Russia's best. Ukraine just proved it wasn't good enough. This is Signal Drop, and we're not done yet. Ukraine's most massive drone raid in the entire history of this war, with Moscow in the crosshairs, is the story dropping next. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss it, because that one changes everything we thought we knew about how far this war can go.